Hey, good morning. It's not morning, it's afternoon. I don't know why I do this literally every time I go live. Good afternoon. This is Shaniqua. Thank you guys so much for joining me. I'm late. I've been having some other issues this morning. And not even necessarily feeling the best, so I probably am not going to be my most energetic self. Y'all, it's cold outside. That's a beautiful thing. Although it's here in Texas, it's predicted to be, I think, back in the 80s tomorrow or so. But for now, it is cold. But with the cold brings challenges for me because I suffer, excuse me, language. I have been, I sometimes have issues with allergies and asthma. And so I've been having those issues these past couple of days. So I'm not necessarily as bubbly as I normally would be. But anyway, let's go ahead and get into this word. So last week we talked about Paul's story and his story and his journey of transformation. And so today, this week, I want to talk about someone else that a lot of people don't necessarily speak about him in terms of transformation because of his journey, because of his story of transformation. But it's one that we can really look at and take a lot from, especially for those who may have had a, let's just say, interesting life. Hey, Nia, thank you for joining. For those who may have had an interesting life. And so today's person that we're going to look at when it comes to the journey of transformation is actually going to be Jonah. Jonah had such a very interesting journey and transformation of who he was and where he started out at. And so let's go ahead and talk about that. I'm going to read Jonah chapter 1 in its entirety. So bear with me. And then I'm going to read just a little bit of Jonah chapter 3, verses 2 through 3. And so again, my apologies for being late. I'm really having issues with my allergies and asthma. If you see this, it's because I have a sinus headache. And if I'm talking a certain way, it's because I don't really have as much energy as I normally would. But that's okay. The word of God will continually go forth and he will have it plant seeds as it is supposed to be. And so let's go ahead and read Jonah chapter 1. And then I'll go ahead and read chapter 3, verses 2 through 3. And I'm reading from the New English Translation. And it said, "The Lord said to Jonah, son of Amittai, go immediately to Niveh, that large capital city, and announce judgment against his people, because their wickedness has come to my attention." Instead, Jonah immediately, let's talk about this. Instead, Jonah immediately headed off to Tarshish to escape from the commission of the Lord. He traveled to Joppa and found a merchant ship leading to Tarshish. So he paid the fare and went aboard so that he could go with them to Tarshish, far away from the Lord. But the Lord hurled a powerful wind on the sea. Such a violent tempest arose on the sea that the ship threatened to break up. The sailors were so afraid that each cried out to his own God, and they flung the ship's cargo overboard to make the ship lighter. Jonah, meanwhile, had gone down into the hold deck below, had laid down, and was sound asleep. The ship's captain reproached him and said, "What are you doing asleep? Get up, cry out to your God. Perhaps your God may take notice on us so that we may not die." The sailors said to one another, "Come on, let's cast lots to find out whose fault is it that this disaster has overtaken us." So they cast lots, and Jonah was singled out. They said to him, "Tell us, whose fault is it that this disaster has overtaken us? What's your occupation? Where you come from? What's your country? And who are your people?" He said to them, "I am Hebrew, and I worship the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land." Hearing this, the men became more afraid and said to him, "Why have you done this?" The men said this because they knew that he was trying to escape from the Lord, because he had previously told them. Because the storm was growing worse and worse, they said to him, "What should we do to you to make the sea quiet down?" He said, "What should we do to you to make the sea quiet down and calm for us?" He said to them, "Pick me up and throw me into the sea to make the sea quiet down, because I know it's my fault you are in this severe storm." Instead, they tried to row back to land, but they were not able to do so because the storm kept growing worse and worse. So they cried out to the Lord, "Oh, please, Lord, don't let us die on account of this man. Don't hold us guilty of shedding innocent blood. After all, you, Lord, have done just as you please." So they picked Jonah up and threw him into the sea, and the sea stopped raging. The men feared the Lord greatly, and earnestly vowed to offer lavish sacrifices to the Lord. And so let me go ahead and read Jonah chapter 3, verse 2-3. It's not going to be as long, where it says, the Lord is talking to Jonah at this point. He says, "Go immediately to Niveh, that large city, and proclaim to the Lord the message that I tell you." So Jonah went immediately to Niveh, as the Lord had said. And now Niveh was an enormous city, and he required 3 days to walk through it. And so I want to talk about this story of transformation when it came to Jonah, because Jonah started out from a spot of rebellion and he went to a spot of submission. But the transformation that Jonah was in, he took people through something with him. And unfortunately, he had some things where we would call that a journey of collateral damage. But let's really look at the beginning. So God had spoken to Jonah and gave Jonah a task and a purpose. Instead of Jonah even responding to God, what it shows us immediately in the beginning of chapter 1 with Jonah is that Jonah, not only did he not respond, he went the opposite. He left, he ran from God, and he got on a ship to sail far away from the calling and the purpose that God had placed on his life. And so Jonah's journey of transformation was rooted in rebellion. And so some people, when they go through life, that they have to understand that even some of the things that they may encounter, some of the storms, it is because they are running from the path of purpose that God has placed on their life. Some transformation has not taken place because it is rooted in rebellion, and it is rooted in disobedience, and it is rooted in all of those things that people are experiencing when they are running from purpose. I work with a lot of nonprofits. I've seen a lot of different things. I've had the opportunity to work in workforce development. And even with workforce development, some of my clients, some of the individuals that came to my office, that I was able to help them get back on their feet when it came to job skillings and up training. Some of the stories that I heard from people who were formerly incarcerated, or for those who struggle with addiction, a lot of the times it's because a part of their story is that they were running from something. They were running from a purpose. They were running from some greater thing that they had in their life. And how many of us know that doesn't even have to be such an extreme thing, but a lot of times that we are doing things, we are rooted in disobedience and rebellion. And so when we look at Jonah's story, we have to understand that Jonah's story again was rooted in the very thing, the opposite of what God desired for him. God desired for Jonah to be able to go and speak to those in Niveh, to be able to deliver them, because they were so rebellious themselves. But Jonah decided he didn't want to do that. What he instead wanted to do was risk the very wrath of God by running away from his purpose. And so when he did that, he got on a boat, he got on a ship with innocent people. And while he was on the ship and while he was on the boat with innocent people, a great storm rose up. And even in the midst of the storm, while they were throwing things overboard and trying to figure out what has caused this storm, Jonah was asleep in the midst of the storm. How ironic is that? He had brought this storm with him. He had brought this situation with him. But in the midst of that, what Jonah was doing is that he had brought collateral damage. And there are sometimes that some of the things that we experience in life, some of the things where we care about people that we love and that we cherish, that we're watching them go through as they may be running from purpose, that in the midst of that, we are then swept up into their storm. We are then swept up into their own various journey of purpose, because we are then collateral damage. This is what these sailors were experiencing when they were with Jonah on this particular boat. God sent Jonah to do a purpose, and God sent Jonah to fulfill and walk in purpose, but Jonah ran away from those things. And because of he ran away, he ran to a situation where other people are around, but instead of notifying them of the purpose that he had on his life, he instead took them into the very heart of his storm-filled battle with God. And they then became collateral damage. And they didn't want to kill Jonah. They didn't want to harm Jonah. But they had gotten to the point where there was nothing else to be done. And Jonah, at this moment, recognized and knew that he had brought people into the midst of his journey, into the midst of his storm, into the midst of his battle. And he said, you can be delivered from this if you cast me away and throw me to the wayside. And so then some of those individuals that I had worked with, again, I've worked with those who have struggled with addiction or have been incarcerated or who have experienced some of the very hardships of life, that they came to a moment within their family, within those that they love them, that they said, you need to let me go. Let me go to this path that I have been committed to in order to be able to save yourself. And so sometimes we are put in that position that no matter how much we love someone, we have to understand that this is their transformation to go through. This is their journey to go through, for their journey to be to be submitted to. No matter how much we may love them or how much we may care for them, it is for them to be able to submit to the path that God has for them. And the path that God had for Jonah after they threw him over was to be swallowed by a large fish. So you understand, and we see that the transformation that Jonah went through, it actually took place when he decided to run from God in rebellion and in his spirit. But it also was at the point where he was in the belly of a fish. And it was at that point that he was so humble before God that he prayed out to him and was just like, Lord, I don't know what else to do. And in the midst of that, God heard his prayer. I'm not going to tell you all the details of their prayer. Go ahead and read Jonah chapter 2. But in the midst of that, God then spoke to the belly to the fish, and the fish vomited Jonah up. And Jonah, from that particular point, then walked into the submission and walked into the passion and walked into the purpose that God always had for him. And I want to pause here for a moment and recognize how ironic it is that Jonah ended up exactly where God wanted him to be. But oh my gosh, he took so many people through hell with him. He went through such a journey. He literally was tossed overboard, swallowed by a big fish before he finally submitted and committed to what God wanted him to do. And then when he went to Niveh, when he went there to deliver the message that God had spoken to those people heeded the message that Jonah had. Those people were saved because Jonah then became a servant of God, and he became a representation of the salvation of those individuals. And so the journey that Jonah was on, when it came to the journey of transformation that he had, was a journey undoubtedly of purpose, but it was a rough journey. Not everyone goes through a journey of transformation, of change, unscathed. But even with this, Jonah not only went through the journey of transformation and change, not only was he not unscathed, but he took people with him. He was in a mode of collateral damage. And so I just want to encourage you, number one, for those who have been through the journey, and for those who had people go through with them and they became collateral damage on their journey of transformation and change and submission. I just want to let you know that God still loves you. That the individuals that went through the storm with you, that they understand that they were just a part of your purpose, but that does not mean that God has forsaken you. That those individuals, they then lived, that they then went on to have life. We don't know what happened to those sailors, but I can only imagine that, again, the seas calmed and they went to their destination where they needed to be. But also, I want you to understand, for those who are in the midst of rebellion, those who are in the midst of a rebellious and a journey of disobedience, understand that you are at such a place that others may be subject to collateral damage because you are walking away, running away from the very thing that God desires for you. And he wants you to submit. And I encourage you to submit to him, because if you don't, then the collateral damage, it amplifies. Those that are around you, those that have gone on the journey with you, those that have walked to some place that they didn't even recognize that you were in the midst of a battle with yourself, in the midst of a battle with God, they will then experience collateral damage. And so today, this message is not one necessarily of encouragement, but it is one of reflection, that when we look at the lives of individuals, when they have been through something, that sometimes the people that they are around go through it with them. And that's okay. Well, it's life. It's life. It's truly life. And it is not always okay. It is not always that people walk away from something, have been unscathed, because these individuals will always remember the storm that they went through with that person. But on the plus side of that, what the sailors also recognized, that they didn't know who was the living God, because before the storm, they worshiped other gods. But after this storm, after having understood what Jonah was going through, they were able to say, "Who are you? Who are you?" And Jonah was like, "I am a Hebrew. I serve the God who created the sea and the land." And my God, that was a testimony even there in the midst of his disobedience, in the midst of his transformation. So there's so much that we can learn from Jonah's story than the fact that he was swallowed by a big fish, or the fact that, hey, Jonah was supposed to go do this and he didn't do this. The lot of times that people don't talk about the collateral damage that was in the midst of Jonah's transformation, in the midst of his change. Howsoever, even then, God's grace was there, because those individuals went on to live. Jonah was thrown up from the belly of the great fish, and he went on to do what God had purposed for him to do. But how much more would his journey have not been, not as rocky, if he simply did what he was called to do in the beginning? I can't speak or say otherwise, because I too have been disobedient in my journey. I too have struggled with running from God, from certain things. Heck, it took me 11 years to finally accept that I was supposed to be a preacher. Like, excuse me, 11 years that I went through hell. But how many people were collateral damage that I was not even aware of, because I was not submissive to what God had desired me to do? The people that I may have been able to speak in those 11 years, speak to, preach to, teach to, that I didn't. I have to live with that. But anyway, I don't necessarily have anything to close this out, to make this particular lesson one of cuteness and where you're able to shout. But I do want you just to take the moment to reflect. You are either a Jonah, or you have been collateral damage in a path of Jonah's story. That's up to you to decide who it is. But in all things and in all ways, God still remains on the throne, and he still has grace for all of us. Thank you so much for this Wednesday word. I'm about to get off, go take me some turmeric and lemon and all this other stuff with my allergies and asthma, and hopefully this sinus headache will go away. But I thank you guys so much for joining me for this Wednesday word, and I will see you next week. Bye-bye.